All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Erik Kramer at WillaKenzie in Yamhill. It's July 17th, 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today, Erik. We really appreciate this.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
First question, most important question for our purposes is why wine?
That's a great question. So I have now been at this for about 20 years. And I did my first harvest up in Washington at a little winery called Chateau Ste. Michelle. And that was after working for about 7 years in the petrochemical industry. So I grew up in Florida and studied geology there. Not a lot of typical wine grapes growing in Florida, nor did I, think about it as a viable career. Initially, I went to college to be a high school science teacher, and my life plan was to be a high school science teacher and a swimming coach. And then I wound up taking a geology class for the high school science teaching program. And thereby decided to change my major. It was something I was just really passionate about and interested in, and wound up pursuing a path in the geosciences for a period of time, and realized working for a big oil company wasn't my life's calling. And then had what I like to refer to as a premature midlife crisis in my late 20s, early 30s, and was given the opportunity to kind of take a step back from what I had been doing. My wife and I were living in Texas at that point in time, and we relocated to the Pacific Northwest for her career. She was working in high tech at the time. She now, incidentally, is a photographer in the Willamette Valley, and her company is CWK Photography. So we've kind of taken this journey together. So most of what she does is in the wine world. So that's been a really neat thing for both of us to be able to share. So we relocated to the Pacific Northwest, and I spent the better part of a year doing some soul searching and perhaps wandering around in my robe a little bit too much. And but I did, food and wine was something that had been interesting to me. I like to cook. I've liked to cook for a really long time, and certainly bottles of wine on the table growing up. And I wound up taking a part-time job in the tasting room for Chateau Ste. Michelle while I was looking for work. And immediately I was like, wow, this wine thing is truly fascinating. I didn't know wine per se at the time, but knew I enjoyed it. And the more that I started learning about it, the more fascinated I became just with it. I was immediately drawn to, I would say, the production side of things, just kind of me being hardwired in the sciences. I think it's something that resonated well with me. And also, I would say it also came into my life at a time when I was looking for something as essentially satisfying. And wine certainly can do that. It's a very, as a career and as a path and as a craft, it's very fulfilling. And I think that was one of the things that I saw in it as a potential career, and wound up working harvest for Chateau Ste. Michelle to see whether or not it was something I really wanted to pursue. When I was thinking about it, I came home, talked to my partner about it, and I said, hey, I think I'm either going to be a winemaker or a chef. And she's kind of like, do the wine thing. The hours for being a chef are challenging, and she had worked in restaurants previously. Not that the hours for winemaking can't be difficult at certain times of year. So yeah, that's kind of how it happened. And worked a few vintages in Washington for a few different producers, and then a couple of harvests into it, I was, at a point where I was kind of interviewing for production jobs in different places and things like that, and decided that it might be advantageous for me to go back and get a little bit more academic grounding in winemaking and viticulture. So this was before my wife and I had kids, and I came up with an idea and started learning a little bit more about overseas programs, and kind of said, hey, what about me getting some more, education in winemaking and grape growing, and you taking some time off, and we kind of have this one overseas adventure before we have kids. And she's like, let's go. So we did. We put our house up for sale and put everything in storage, and unfortunately had to give our dogs away. We were living in Kirkland, Washington at the time. And I had learned about a couple of really good programs, both one in Australia at the University of Adelaide, and then another one in New Zealand at an agricultural school on the South Island called Lincoln University. And decided to pursue the New Zealand route. Some of that was a function of simply just wanting to live in New Zealand because it's beautiful and it's amazing and it doesn't even look real in a lot of places. But I also, the program's specific focus on cool climate winemaking and viticulture is something that resonated with me. And additionally, I liked that the nature of the program that I was enrolled in there had, I would say, an even focus to both viticulture and enology, as opposed to picking one versus the other. So then ultimately we packed things up, moved down to New Zealand at the end of 2002, and came back here into the US in the summer of '04. And we knew we were going to come back to the Pacific Northwest. And then when I was interviewing in both Washington State as well as the Willamette Valley. And the more time we spent in the Willamette Valley, we knew that's where we wanted to grow some roots. So here we are.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So before we get to that, I'm curious, backtracking a little bit to working at Chateau Ste. Michelle, obviously the tiny little winery in Washington.
Yeah.
I'm curious about initial impressions as you got into the tasting room side and the production side. What about the industry drew you in addition to your sort of the scientific part of it?
Wine as a way to bring people together. I like it's just it's such a fascinating, not to dumb it down, beverage, but it's a beverage that it's about community and bringing people together. And it's enjoyable, and it's about enjoyment of life, and there's stories behind wine. I think that just is just learning more about wine as something to both enjoy, but as a subject. It's just really fascinating in terms of the geography and how is it grown, and there's different styles that I was just drawn to that. And then on the production side of things, I would say, like, within the first few days of working harvest, I kind of knew, like, yes, just the nuts and boltsy side of things, the operational side of things, the hands-on nature of wine. It's a very, very dynamic. At least, for me, I find it to be a very dynamic profession because you get to do so many different things. In terms of things like speaking and engagement, but then also the biology associated with growing plants and the sciencey nature of wine. But as I've grown as a winemaker, the less I think about science and the more I kind of think about style. And where do the science, to me, ultimately they're guardrails that are there that you can pay attention to it if you want to or not. It's not to me, and it's definitely not necessary to have an academic credential in winemaking to know how to make great wine. It just, I think, for me, in a competitive world where you're looking for perhaps limited opportunities, sometimes an opportunity to, carve out a little home for yourself doesn't hurt. Yeah.
You mentioned one of the things that attracted you to the program in New Zealand was the balance between viticulture and enology. Tell me about the formalized education. What did you learn about viticulture and enology that you took forward with you? And as you mentioned, the guardrails. What did you learn about it? And then what did you at what point did you kind of start pushing against what you had learned?
Yeah, I think some of it was just a theoretical foundation for certain things in terms of how you think about it. It can influence how you think about certain things with respect to wine, whether it's how you think about tannin or the things that make up tannin, and what does that mean ultimately, when you're making choices about style with respect to grape growing, I could come up with umpteen, 1,000 examples. But I think just some of the theoretical stuff, it's generally there in the back of my mind. I would say I leaned on it a lot more in the early days because I didn't really know anything about style, and with limited experience, it's a lot easier to kind of simply just read voraciously through a book and understand things, but that doesn't mean you know how to make wine. And so I think, but I think one of the things, honestly, that I took from being down there was simply the opportunity to be truly immersed in wine for a period of time with a really great cohort of other students. And, this extends beyond, this well beyond the classroom, but just engaging in tasting groups and hanging out with some of my classmates and just talking about wine and really learning to develop your own sense of, what does style mean, or really working on your palate. I think, as human beings, we're not trained to communicate about how something makes you feel. How something like wine makes you feel. How does it feel, on the palate? And ultimately, as a winemaker, you're creating something that conjures some degree of feeling. And in a professional setting, like when I'm working with my team, for example, it's there's value in understanding how to communicate with each other about what we're sensing and feeling, because ultimately there will be executional or kind of operational decisions that we make that are aimed at achieving some certain style endpoint. So the feeling is communicating, do I like it? Why do I like it? What about it do I like? Okay, all right, what can we do in order to achieve this particular thing? And and it's about, certainly that sense of place, and we'll get to WillaKenzie, but WillaKenzie, it's about truly respecting a sense of place. But there's certainly a style endpoint in mind in terms of what we're trying to achieve here, and that's one of the great things about wine as well, is just that in the Willamette Valley, you could talk to 10 different winemakers about their own perception of style and what does that mean to them, and you're going to get a lot of different answers, and that's just cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, as long as we have a winemaker here, let's talk about your sense of style and your kind of winemaking philosophy as it's developed over the years. I'm especially curious, since you talk about kind of leaning on the knowledge early on and then kind of breaking free of that. At what point do you develop your own sense of style? What point did you develop your own philosophy for what you wanted wine to taste like? Yeah, that's a great question. So I had the great fortune of working with a really talented winemaker at Adelsheim Vineyard for about 6 years. Dave Page, and I think so I would say I would consider this fine gentleman to be a good friend, but also a great mentor to me. And I think it's important to have for something that's kind of crafty like this. I find it was important for me to have a mentor. Doesn't mean that ultimately the choices that you wind up making are going to be the same. But to understand the questions maybe to ask yourself along the way. What are the things that it's important to kick the tires and kick them hard over and over again. For me, on a personal basis, as I've grown as a winemaker, it's really come down to palate. And I spend a lot more time thinking about palate, shape, and texture than I do about aroma, unless it's provided unless it's an aroma that I have an issue with. But a lot of it is about creating this complete textural picture, and that's while maintaining that that sense of purity and reflection of place. But I do recall having a couple of winemakers that I've in addition to Dave, my mentor, a couple of winemakers that I've worked for over time, both in Washington and New Zealand, the notion of texture. It's one of those things that you hear, if you're paying attention, you hear it. And I think, I don't think that's a mistake. Personally, I don't think that's a mistake. I think it's when something just simply makes your palate feel good,
in terms of whether it's warmth or mouthfilling or velvety or energy, and and you're not left wanting for more. There's something to that texture, textural completeness, if you will. Yeah.
So how do you, as a winemaker, learn to magnify that? How do you learn to focus on texture from a more technical or artistic side?
Yeah, it's not particularly. I mean, I think what you learn is you can pay attention to certain kinds of things technically that might influence some operational decisions, so that you can get to a style. To me, one of the phrases that I'll use with people that I'm working with is very much a begin with the end in mind approach to winemaking. Really have a good, solid understanding of where you'd like to go stylistically with something. Otherwise, you're simply just going to be left with a wine that, here's what we have, versus this is really what I intended to do. And so, whether that's the timing of a picking decision and how you extract, both extracting, kind of during processing, but also extracting, later on, in those early stages of a wine's life. I'm speaking about Pinot, but we could be talking about Cabernet, and to me it would be the same. It'd be the same kind of conversation. I would still probably wind up coming back to texture, and I don't want to go down the geek road of paying attention to catechin or epicatechin and that kind of stuff, because those are like the guardrails, and it's kind of like, the information is out there, and if it's worth paying attention to, I'll pay attention to it. But if it's information for information's sake, it doesn't do anything for you. So for me, like when making and when I'm thinking, if I were thinking about Pinot Noir, oftentimes for me, there are things that move in terms of quality. There are things that move the needle like this, or there are things that move the needle like this. And so there's real value to me in paying attention to the things that really make the needle move. And when we feel like we've solved all those problems and figured all that stuff out, then we can start to pay more of attention to these things that make the needle go like that. So the time, something about the timing of a picking decision. It's a style. It's a stylistically oriented decision. It's how are we extracting at different stages of primary fermentation. Those are style oriented kinds of decisions, and what is our approach to managing acidity, but all of those over time, a lot of those things have become more kind of it's about feeling and intuition. But then also, to get to WillaKenzie, it's also knowing what works best for this particular place. The approaches to me that you take with one estate or one vineyard in, say, the Yamhill Carlton district on WillaKenzie soils would be very different than perhaps you may want to take on something that's planted on a different soil series where the plants behave differently. And the plants give you a lot of information, to me, about kind of what's going on with your wines, and the wine gives you a lot of information about what's going on with plants, and you get a lot of the guesswork or the intuition or the questions you're asking yourself, for me, are happening during the growing season when I'm just simply walking up and down rows and thinking, and if I noticed something about a particular wine at one point in time that maybe I had an issue with or didn't like, and the first place I'll generally look is out in some block somewhere and kind of go and, all right, is there something here that I'm not seeing? And that's that gets back to the whole dynamic. It's so fascinating how dynamic it can be and is. Because each year you're met with a different set of challenges, and an experimentation is super fun and super cool, and it's very gratifying to come up with some ideas. All right, what can we do to make this wine taste a little bit better? And when you execute on those experiments, and sometimes you find something that's worth pursuing, and sometimes you don't. But it's fun.
So I'm curious, as you're in the process of winemaking, you're somewhere between the grapes and the finished product. How do you judge your wine? What are you looking for as you're tasting and preparing to blend or not blend, or what is the main judging characteristic for you?
Balance and just clarity. So balance meaning that texturally complete picture where there's nothing that sticks out like a sore thumb that I have an issue with. So a wine going into your mouth with enough intensity to grab your attention. And then it's simply feeling good texturally, meaning like there are times when I've mentioned this to, other interviewers, that kind of a thing, where if I can have a situation where my mouth feels better when the wine is in it than when it's empty, then that wine has met the goal of textural completeness. And so it's intense. It's got energy. It grabs your attention. It simply feels good. It feels balanced, meaning there's no tannin or acidity, nothing that's cloying in any way. And then as it's finishing, there's enough of an intensity and length on the finish for me to remember that particular wine and know that I enjoyed it. And then clarity is really about that, that sense of place. That sense of style, for me and what we're doing here. If I were to talk about, the style that, we're truly trying to pursue here, it's clarity of fruit, clarity of place, and seamlessness.
Seamlessness. Tell me what you mean by that.
A wine should just flow effortlessly across the palate. As opposed to something that says, "Oh, I love the acidity on this wine." I like the acidity too, but I don't want that to be the be-all, end-all. It needs to be part of that balanced picture. A wine that has enough structural acidity, has energy and freshness and tension, but not so much to the point where I'm like, "Boy, that's really tart and acidic," and nothing sticks out. And I would say we go throughout the process, whether that's during the grape growing, the winemaking, or the blending process, we're going to great lengths to try to get there, and that in itself is fun and gratifying. But it's lengthy and it's time consuming, and it takes patience, and it takes a lot of focus, and sometimes a strong liver. Yes.
So when last we left off, you had kind of fallen to the Willamette Valley as you were looking for jobs and you came back. Tell me as you kind of decided this is where you wanted to be, tell me about the next step. Where was the first place that you worked when you came back to the Northwest?
Yeah, so I worked for a winery called Terroir for a short period of time when we came back into the Willamette Valley, and it was a neat, fun little place to work. And I got a phone call from Dave Page, the winemaker at Adelsheim, within a year of having come back into the Willamette Valley, and he'd gotten a hold of my resume or something like that, and asked if I'd ever be interested in coming to work with him, and I was like, let's talk. And so I think after my first interview with him, I knew pretty quickly, and I was looking for just an estate place like that, and someone who I felt could be a really great teacher. And between the place and the reputation of Adelsheim, but then also having an opportunity to work with a really great teacher like Dave, I think I knew within the first hour of an interview. I was like, this is the guy. This is the gentleman who I need to work for a while. And we worked together for 6 years and had a lot of great time together. Spent, I would say, at least 50% of that time just laughing and drinking, and learning how to communicate, with each other, and supporting each other, and it was just a truly awesome opportunity.
So tell me about your role there, official role, and then maybe kind of what it grew into being as you're there.
Yeah, so I started there as a cellar master, basically kind of running cellar operations and helping to ensure that work in the cellar is being executed, on a timely manner and appropriately, but having a pretty big, even initially, a pretty big role in, what's happening with the wines. And my first harvest there in 2005, I remember Dave asking me, "So you want to run with the whites?" And I'm like, "Sure." I'm a believer in being put in a, it's important to grow. One really good way to grow professionally is to be put in a position where I call it the uncomfortable squirm. And I've used that phrase with people who've worked with me. Like, it's good to be a little bit. It's good to be a little bit uncomfortable, and provided you've got the support to be uncomfortable. But it's good to be a little bit uncomfortable because you get stretched. And so I was certainly uncomfortable that first harvest, running with several hundred tons of Pinot Gris and Chardonnay, and learned how to make it work. And I would say some of the early, the early foundation of the approaches to just white winemaking and texture and balance were laid during those early years of me kind of running with whites at Adelsheim.
So obviously Adelsheim, one of the more well-known places in the valley. Tell me about working there and what you kind of took with you as you went on in the valley. What were the things what kind of the lessons you learned that you kind of tucked away for the future?
Yeah, I would say the note, and from a winemaking perspective, maintaining purity and balance and if you familiarize with yourself with the Adelsheim style, they're certainly about clarity and balance, and also I also realized pretty quickly during those early days, really enjoying the estate, having the access to work with estate vineyards that you get to work with over and over and over again. So you get to know those blocks and those parcels and understand the farming and the influence of farming on winemaking and how does that change your decisions in one way or another. It's all of those things are really, really important. And I also realized that I kind of like that size, big enough to play around and experiment, but not so big that you kind of feel out of touch with day-to-day ops and that kind of stuff, but small enough to still feel like a small winery. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what happens next after Adelsheim? What prompts you to leave?
After 6 years of working with a great mentor, you start to kind of develop your own notion of style but then also being a young dad and looking for growth opportunities and that kind of stuff, and having a family. I've got my kids are teenagers now. My son was actually born in New Zealand, so he's got 2 passports. That was not part of the plan, but it did happen, and plans change. So that was kind of an added bonus, coming back with a Kiwi of our very own. I had an opportunity to take over overseeing winemaking and grape growing for Domaine Serene in 2011, and it was a unique opportunity and one that I felt would be worthwhile to pursue.
So tell me about your experiences there.
Yeah, again with the uncomfortable, I can come back to the uncomfortable squirm. In 2011, that was my first harvest where, you know, truly overseeing everything, where all that ultimate responsibility rests on your shoulders, and it's a pretty heavy burden. I think one of the things that you know, that I learned about, you know, working for Domaine Serene, not just at the inception, but through to my last vintage there, which was 2016, and then, you know, ultimately having overseen, you know, stuff there, but then also in France and Burgundy and traveling a lot back and forth, you learn what you're capable of doing. And that's, you know, and you know, when you go through an exercise like that, working in an environment where expectations are high, and you're tasked with overseeing production of exquisite wines, but then also expanding growth, you know, growth of vineyards, growth of production, growth of portfolio, expansion of portfolio to transcend 2 countries. That's, you know, that's the uncomfortable squirm, and you're stretched, but it's a confidence building exercise when you go through something like that as well, because you get a sense for what you're capable of, and it changes how you think. I think one of the things that I was forced to do there, because I like to be, you know, an operational, pretty hands-on winemaker, there was a point there that I couldn't do that anymore, because the responsibilities were simply too vast. And that wasn't, you know, and to be clear, that wasn't why, you know, I made the decision to ultimately leave Domaine Serene. But it was something that I learned in order to be successful in overseeing, you know, a couple of projects in different countries while you're growing vineyards, and, you know, overseeing construction of a new winery. You know, we built new winery space while I was there. I don't get to be involved in every little operational decision. I can set direction, but I don't get to be involved in every little thing, and that's okay. I think you also learn how to work well with teams, you know, really well with teams of people when you're supported by a strong team, and help. And that's where it becomes really important to help your team understand, here's where we're going stylistically, but here's why we're going here stylistically, and encourage your team, and help ensure that everyone understands, here's a direction. When we're all moving in the same direction, we can achieve really great things. And that was a really cool thing to be a part of.
So then, next step after that, it's coming here. So tell me what attracted you about this position.
Yeah, I think, you know, honestly, WillaKenzie is an estate that I had been interested in before I left Adelsheim. I had actually approached Bernie, probably 10 years ago now, you know, and just approached him personally, professionally, and had indicated to him, like, if there were any opportunities at some point down the road, be a place I'd be interested in working, simply because of the estate. And so I think, like, for you know, as a wine grower, winemaker, you're limited by the quality of the raw material that you get a chance to work with. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most unique and diverse estates in the North Willamette Valley. So having an opportunity to work with a piece of ground like this was pretty cool when that opportunity came up. And I've, you know, the last few years really just kind of digging in here, no pun intended, has been super fun, getting to understand the property and you know, and engage in some kind of infrastructural updates to help, you know, elevate the vineyard, you know, the estate to its full potential. You know, but we've learned a little bit more about the, you know, I've learned more about the geology here since I started, that's kind of influenced opinions about, you know, what the wines are, why they are the way they are, and it's super fun. But yeah, so the opportunity to work with this estate was pretty intriguing, and then the opportunity to work with an outfit like Jackson Family Wines was also pretty appealing to me.
Talk about that. in a second. But I'm curious, since you've mentioned the estate and its uniqueness, obviously you're still getting to know it, but as you understand it now, tell me what is unique? What is the terroir here what is unique about the terroir here that excites you?
The diverse nature of the topography here is pretty fascinating. So, we have 100 acres of grapes planted here on the estate. About 75% of that is Pinot Noir. The Pinot Noir is carved up into lots of little small blocks like other estates are. But we've got a few different ridge lines here. So not only are we dealing with a lot of vertical variation here, in terms of vertical relief, 300 some odd feet at its lowest point to over 700 feet at its highest point, but the different ridge lines create for some different exposures and different terroirs and give us the ability to make 6 terroir-specific wines from different parts of the estate that are really great, and Pinot as a varietal really does seem to express its sense of place very, very clearly. And to get to work with a place that offers that kind of diversity is really neat. Both purely from an explorational detective. One of the things that I feel like it's a job of a wine grower to do is, your job is to find the best wine on the property. And sometimes, it's, oh yeah, this block's great, that block. You don't really know. And the detective work associated with finding it, I think, is like super fun, and it's like putting together puzzles and stuff. I've learned within the last year that we actually have 2 fault lines running through the property. And while it's all uplifted marine sediments called WillaKenzie soils, the parent material for the marine sediments is different in a couple of different spots. And those differences are very closely aligned with some of the wine-related differences that we see. And I think that it's fascinating. It's a fascinating thing. And we continue to learn, more as we're, carve up blocks a little bit more and play around a little bit more. So I think, that nature of that diversity is something that I think is, it's a unique thing that I simply like about this estate.
I'm curious when it comes to when it comes to learning a place like this that is so unique and has so many interesting things going on. How do you go about exploring and learning and finding the best wine while also sort of maintaining all the other things you have to do on the winemaking cycle? How do you find time to explore and dig in and really learn your it's a process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years, and so for me, your first vintage at a place like this is just like, what's a baseline? Let's just kind of understand what a baseline is. How are these wines wanting to express themselves? But with a clear style endpoint in mind. So that WillaKenzie sense of place, but also thinking about clarity, seamlessness, and finesse. So making wines in a way that kind of achieve that style. You'll never get and with the estate grown thing, you'll never get away from it being like WillaKenzie, because this is where it's from. It will always taste like WillaKenzie. But can you create a WillaKenzie that offers something that's clearly recognizable as something that is fruity? Because the WillaKenzie estate property, it wants to make wines that I think we feel here can be kind of savory. They will always be kind of savory. But can we offer a little bit more clarity of fruit? And working with sedimentary soils like these, there seems to be a degree of tension that comes along with the Pinot Noir here, and you find that a lot with wines grown on sedimentary soils in the Willamette Valley, because this is the plant's response to growing in an environment that is a little more stress-prone than, say, on volcanic soils, where they're looser and more fluffy, and the plants are naturally a little bit more vigorous, and perhaps the skins are a little bit thinner. And so you get, there's those different kinds of expressions. So year one is really just simply understanding. Year 2 is, all right, we understand a little bit. Are there things that we feel like we could be building on? And it's, there's a word that I use when I speak about the blending process, but I could apply it to this, understanding in general, is iterative. The first iteration, this is where the science geek kind of comes in for me, because it's this very logical, stepwise approach. First iterate, I don't know if you
And I got that word actually, if you read Jurassic Park, remember Michael Crichton using that, the first iteration? That was where I stole that from Michael Crichton, using it in his chapters of that book. But it's still it's a word that makes sense to me when thinking about that kind of exploration. So it's an exploratory process. You learn, and the wine, and in year one, the wine is, after the first vintage, the wine is giving you information, perhaps a little bit about what's going on in the vineyard. Oh, this block over here, there's a degree of structural tension as well as an aroma that I'm familiar with, that I may have seen in some other place that I've worked, that reminds me of something that could be going on in the vineyard. And then you go out in the middle of the growing season or towards the end of the growing season, and you see what the canopy is doing, and the canopy says, please pay attention to me, because if you pay more attention to me, I will help you improve your wines. And so it's that kind of thing. And we went through that in the 19 vintage with a parcel where the canopy was giving you information, and we carved up the parcel a little bit more, and I think we found better wine because we carved up the parcel a little bit more. So that's just going through that kind of process each year. We've also, since I started here, we've essentially gutted and put back together the winery. So we have a number of small parcels of Pinot Noir here, and under the previous, with the previous infrastructure here, we had a lot of pretty large tanks, I would say, for this size winery, and not enough small fermenters. And we've simply put it back together, changed the geometry of the tanks a little bit, and put a lot more tanks. We haven't changed the capacity, just a lot more containers, a lot more vessels, so that we can really maximize the differentiation across the estate, and that also really, really understand each small level of detail with all the little individual blocks. And we did that just prior to the 2019 vintage. So we took that, I would say, the new updated winery for a test drive just last year, which was a lot of fun.
So obviously, you've worked at some pretty big and well-known places here in the valley in your stops along the way. I'm curious. You mentioned Jackson Family as being a contributing factor to you wanting to be here. What about them, in addition to this place, what about them intrigued you as a potential place to work, and what have you seen in terms of the way they've handled this estate?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found pretty attractive to this opportunity, working with Jackson Family, it was the level of trust and autonomy to say, here, Erik, here's WillaKenzie. And so that was super cool. Here are the keys, go for a drive, let us know if it needs a tune-up, maybe a coat of wax, a new coat of paint or something like that. And so that's been, really fun and gratifying, and that kind of support has been great. And just, honestly, just the culture, of Jackson Family Wines has been a really wonderful thing to be a part of.
Both the WillaKenzie name and the Jackson Family name have a pretty high level of trust and of expectation, I suppose, attached to them. I'm curious about the pressure that comes along with working for both of those names.
Yeah.
How does it affect? How have you dealt with it, and how have you felt that?
I'm comfortable working in a high expectation environment, and it hasn't bothered me all that much. And I'll just leave it at that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. As you know, we're here in July of 2020, so we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. I'm curious how that has affected your work, if at all, and how it's affected the winery here, and maybe how it's affected what you're looking for towards the future.
Yeah, it's a tough year for all of us, for so many people. This is the whole. I'm not talking about wine. I'm talking about the whole world, and I think we all have had to learn how to manage expectations about what's realistic and empathize with things that are going on, not just domestically but globally in this really scary and confusing time. I think initially, there's a degree of shock that goes along with something like this, both professionally, but then also personally, and what does it mean for the people you care about and all that kind of stuff. But as time has progressed over the course of the last few months, there's a degree, I would say, a certain degree of acceptance that comes along with that, and digging in, and you'll get through it, and working with your coworkers, your friends, and colleagues to come up with ways and ideas to get through it, and strategizing. Day-to-day operations here at WillaKenzie, have changed, but other than keeping this thing on, most of the time, the way that we taste has certainly had to change. Working in a situation where we used to share a lot of glassware, we certainly don't get to do that. Socially distant tasting is different when we're physically separating ourselves while we're tasting now as well. As certainly not sharing glassware. That's a change that's taken a little bit of getting used to, and it's become a little bit more complicated, for us in terms of the amount of time that it takes to prepare for that kind of tasting. So it's been a little more time consuming. And I would say the other thing is the approach to winemaking and working on blends that I've taken is a reflection of where I learned, which was Adelsheim. It's a very team-oriented approach, and we're all so it's my entire staff when we're tasting through these things and talking and sharing ideas. We don't get to do that quite as much. So so that's difficult to not do that quite as much as we like to be able to do as a function of space, time, resources. So that's had to change for the time being. My hope is that gets back to normal at some point when it seems like it's okay. I would say from a what are we making kind of standpoint, you have to anticipate, perhaps, pivoting in terms of production and portfolio a little bit. We've had to, go through some of that and do some forecasting in terms of, what does the current wine market look like? What does demand look like? What does supply look like? Do some strategic planning there and do a little bit of pivoting there. And it's had some implications here and there, but nothing that isn't different. Nothing that's particularly different from lots of other wineries that are going through this at the same point in time. Getting used to doing virtual tastings. That's certainly a new thing that I actually think that seems there's that's a real an upside to this, and being able to engage with wine drinkers on the East Coast. That normally would have taken either a trip somewhere or would have needed to be planned, and now there's a real opportunity to engage with customers at a distance, and that's actually been super fun, and doing that certainly with much more frequency than might have ever happened. Those are just a few examples. I would say preparing for harvest, that's a big one.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, so the COVID harvest preparations. And this is where, you see that the strength of not just Jackson family, the strength of the Willamette Valley community. That's another thing that has just been, a real joy to be a part of, for the last, 15 plus years now, is to be working in the Willamette Valley wine community. And one of the things that's been so successful, why are Willamette Valley wines, why have they come so far so quickly within the time sense of the time span of the wine world? That sense of community that was established, in the early days by gentlemen like David Adelsheim, who's still very active, but then also, the David Letts and, the Dickie Rath and the Ponzis. That uniting together to achieve a common goal, that's definitely transcended time. And we're absolutely seeing that in terms of how to handle COVID. And the Willamette Valley Winery Association is doing just a great job pooling together resources and ideas and information on how to handle things and what does it look like and how are we processing and pulling ideas from other parts of the world, like New Zealand, for example, who've already gone through a COVID harvest, so we can kind of tap into those resources there. So harvest is going to look different this year, and we'll need to slow things down. And going into harvest this year, the clear and most important thing is human health. If we work on putting health, immunity, all that, or not immunity per se, but protection first, then we will get to make wine. If we don't, we run the risk of not being able to, and that would be a real tragedy. But not just a tragedy. Nobody wants to see anybody get sick, and so working under a COVID harvest is really all about that this year. So that's the big one that's really high on my radar screen right now.
What are the biggest changes you've seen in the Oregon wine industry since you've been a part of it? What's the biggest difference between when you started working and now? A couple of things. Certainly the growing up and evolution. Where I think when I started here in the Willamette Valley, it was like right on the heels of when this movie Sideways came out, and everybody was like, "Oh, Pinot Noir! Must be a really wonderful grape, and it makes amazing wine, and causes people to sit in the corner and covet this bottle," kind of a thing, like Paul Giamatti did in that film. I would say like the flag has been firmly placed in the ground for Oregon and the Willamette Valley as one of the two best places to grow Pinot Noir. It's there. And so that's a really cool thing. It was on the way to getting there, but I would say it's there now. My hope would be that flag is there for Chardonnay in the not so distant future. So that, Chardonnay certainly coming of age is something that I've seen, and it's been neat to be a part of, because it's great to be a part of a region that's capable of making the kind of Chardonnay we are here in the Willamette Valley. The level of investment here in the Willamette Valley, that's certainly a nod to the potential of the region. Both domestically, like investments from Jackson Family Wines, but internationally, like Maison Louis Jadot digging in here as well. So seeing that is just kind of further validation to what's going on as well. That's certainly a lot of what I've seen. And it's I would say for younger winemakers, it's gotten more competitive. It's more competitive, and that's a function of just the growth of the region and people realizing this is a really cool, fun place to be. I think one of the nice things about the Willamette Valley, beyond great wine, it's just a really nice place to live. Portland's not that far away. I live in McMinnville. McMinnville's a cool little town. The food scene here is great. The agricultural scene here is great, and so the quality of life here is just very high. Yeah. What about as you look ahead for the Oregon wine industry? What do you see it looking like over the next 5 to 10 years?
I see Chardonnay still continuing to play, a big role in the region's growth. Perhaps sparkling wine starting to play a bigger role in the region's growth. I see continued development of new AVAs. We just had a couple of new AVAs pop up here in the last few months, which is terrific for some producers. Perhaps more growth and planting of wine grapes in other parts of the Willamette Valley that may not have necessarily been explored as of late. Perhaps continued planting at higher elevations as a function of climate change and what's possible. I think to get to the climate change conversation, I think like right now, as far as plant material is concerned, we can still kind of keep working with what we have, but it's something that I think needs to be in the back of our minds as we continue to grow and evolve and as a region, and experimenting with, kind of keep that experimental box open, if you will. Pay attention to plant material in a changing world.
What about for the future for yourself? What do you see for yourself over the next 5 to 10 years?
Certainly, with WillaKenzie, I would, love to see, more of the estate, achieving its full potential. I would say, the best wines from WillaKenzie are certainly yet to come, and so seeing what we can do here with that, not just with Pinot Noir, but with Chardonnay and with sparkling wine as well. And I don't know, beyond that, I think we'll see what my kids wind up doing. My son is now working at Stoller, so he's in high school, but he's working at Stoller. So he's got his first winery job, albeit working washing glassware, but he worked his first bottling line day a couple of weeks ago. And he's expressed some interest in pursuing winemaking as a career without any prodding or pushing from his parents. So I think some of that might be contingent upon what our kids want to do. Yeah.
In terms of the property here, you mentioned that you think that the best WillaKenzie wines are yet to come. Is there anything you have sort of planned that you talk about experimentation, is there anything different you want to do, anything different to plant or anything different to on a bigger scale that will be noticeable, or is it just kind of fine tuning what you have?
It's really about the tinkering and the fine tuning. It's not, we're not doing anything particularly miraculous here. I would say we have a little bit of redevelopment going on with, a couple of underperforming parcels, and, changing plant material around a little bit, but nothing crazy or earth-shattering. We've created a couple of new wines. There's a new terroir-specific wine from a specific part of the estate that hadn't been isolated before, that it seemed like it was worthy of isolating that one. So that's been kind of neat. We'll release our first sparkling wine in 2024. We have some new Chardonnay. Excuse me. We have some new Chardonnay coming online. We did this year in 2019 that will kind of change the picture for what our estate Chardonnay can be. So we'll be bottling up our first wine using that part of the estate with the 19 vintage. So that's going to be fun, and we'll see what the future holds with some of this other redevelopment that we have planned.
All right. You mentioned your son getting interested in the industry. I'm sure that you've probably been approached before by people asking for your advice or words of wisdom on getting into Oregon wine. So if someone were to told you they wanted to join the industry tomorrow, what would your words of wisdom to them be?
Oh, well, I'd probably ask them, do you want to be a winemaker? And if they asked me if I were a winemaker, I'd say, are you sure? Because there are a lot of these notions about, winemaking as a career. But it's a super fun, dynamic job. It is a truly great industry to, just the Willamette Valley wine industry. It is a truly great industry to be a part of because of that communal kind of collegiality kind of thing. Whether that's coming together through times of crisis like COVID, or getting to be involved in things like Oregon Pinot Noir Camp, or things like IPNC. And it's just fun, and it's fun to get to hang out with a bunch of other winos and talk about what we like and get to share something that we're all passionate about, like wine. And I would say, there are so many different layers and levels of the Willamette Valley wine industry, whether that's careers in winemaking or careers in things like marketing, or administration or sales, but we all get to be a part of it, and ultimately we're all aiming for the same thing. But advice-wise, if I were speaking to someone looking for like a career as a winemaker, I'd say find a good mentor. And I might say the same kind of thing for other career paths, although that's this is the one that I've chosen. But never a bad idea to find a great individual to work for who can be a good teacher. And I think that's one of the things that I've actually realized, like in this profession for me, is I actually, like when I set out to be a high school science teacher and a swimming coach, my kids are both better swimmers than I ever was. My daughter was a state champion in 50-meter freestyle a couple of years ago. And but the mentoring thing I get to do with teams and get to teach, and so I still kind of get to do a lot of what I liked anyway. Yeah.
All right, that's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that we should have covered?
You didn't ask me about my favorite Halloween costume, but that's okay. I won't take that personally. But
for the follow-up.
Yeah. Well, maybe some other time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today, for exactly virtual handshake, for hosting us here today and sharing your story with us. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thanks, man.